I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and this is part 2 of our interview with John Daring about a number of interesting and unexplained phenomena. Well, in our last interview, we described a number of alternative physics ideas, including unified field theories, and I was wondering if we could touch on, this time, the Philadelphia Experiment. I've had the impression that you support the notion of this experiment being similar to what the rumors describe, and I was wondering if you could provide any details on the story and describe the physical scale of this experiment and why it may have been related to the alleged unexpected results.
Yeah, well, the Philadelphia experiment, I believe, started actually with a pretty down-to-earth goal, which was to come up with a type of stealth or low observable technology for something as large as a Navy ship. The goal of the experiment was to try and change the radar reflectivity of the hull of the ship by imposing a strong magnetic field. Now, these kind of ideas, believe it or not, actually are talked about occasionally in the stealth or low observables community, and it is based on the fact that it's really quite sort of sophomore or junior level electromagnetic physics, that if you take certain materials and you put them into a strong magnetic field, you'll find that the way that the electrons in the material behave at particular frequencies are different. So that, for example, if you hit that steel with a radar wave, let's say, that has a 1 gigahertz frequency, and the magnetic field is tuned to create a particular type of condition in the steel, the electrons are not able to basically as effectively re-radiate or reflect that radar back to the transmitter. Hence, the ship appears to be less observable, or as we say nowadays, low observable, meaning the ship actually looks as if it's got a much smaller cross-section to the radar beam. Could even be interpreted as being further away, or maybe it's not even a ship, it looks too small. That might have been the goal of the experiment. And in order to accomplish that, what was done is degaussing coils were placed around the ship, probably in a pattern a little more complicated than what would have been used for ordinary degaussing or deperming of the ship, which is removing the residual magnetic field that develops over time. And also the magnetic field required for the stealth effect was a lot stronger. The type of ship used in the Philadelphia experiment, and this was something that Jim Coram was responsible for really bringing this to everyone's attention, it made perfect sense. The destroyer escorts were one of the few Navy ships that basically had fairly high-powered generators on board. They were an electric drive ship, as I recall, and hence they had these large synchronous motor generator pairs. The generators were capable. I think the combined output power of the two generators on the Eldridge is something around 8 to 9 megawatts of power, so it's a pretty substantial amount of electric power. And if a good fraction of that was placed through those magnetic field coils, you're probably talking about magnetic fields that might have been on the order of about 10 to 100 times larger than they would normally have been for degaussing operations. And then there may have been pulsing and resonant buildup techniques that were applied to get the field strength to be well above that. So that's kind of a little bit of an intro to the experiment. Now, what appears to have happened, in my opinion, is that based on the fact that this experiment was intended to produce a low observable effect in the radar domain, there probably was no interest whatsoever in any application of unified field theory. I don't think anybody would have gone to the Navy and said, hey, I think we can make a ship optically invisible. I don't believe anybody would have even touched that, and I believe if anybody had remotely suggested something like teleportation or causing the ship to just literally physically disappear, I believe, frankly, that person would have been kicked out of the office, and rightfully so, because, this was a wartime situation, and people were urgently concerned with trying to protect ships. They were not looking for science fiction. What happened? Well, apparently they got into what we would consider sort of a science fiction domain. And this happened because of the fact that, unknown to them, the ship probably, in that configuration with the magnetic field and the high power, probably crossed a threshold for one of these nonlinear effects in unified field theory. The theory of unified field says that you can link electromagnetic and gravitational forces together. It does not necessarily say under what conditions those are going to show up. For that, you have to really dig through it a lot more. You have to get that. And to find that little nugget, you'll realize that not only is it a matter of having a particular geometry or shape for your electrical hardware operating at a particular frequency, you have to have a certain amount of power put into this before that effect will show up, meaning you cannot arbitrarily scale this effect down to a little tiny tabletop experiment. It may only show up, at least in many cases, when the experiment gets large enough such that the total amount of power going into it and the average electromagnetic field strength or intensity, plus the presence of certain materials and the field in a particular geometry or pattern, if you will, determining the flow of electromagnetic power, and a condition also that requires that you pay close attention to things like the polarization of the field and just a ton of parameters that go along with this. You must have a certain minimum amount of power and a certain minimum size to the system, or scale, if you will, before this effect shows up. And I believe that what happened with the Philadelphia experiment is that, unknown to them when they were designing this radar canceling experiment, they designed an experiment that crossed over the threshold for a nonlinear excitation mode of the electromagnetic gravitational field. And the way that this links is that a very large magnetic field produced, for example, in this case, to try and null out the ship's radar signature, was linking through the vector magnetic potential, which is the A field, if for those of you that are familiar with electromagnetism, to the torsion structure, the torsion tensor, and this in turn is able to induce curvature fields. So you have this complicated experiment that came together to try and make the ship invisible to radar. And at some point, they crossed a threshold, probably as they upped the power going into the coil, and suddenly these nonlinear effects began to show up, and these guys are wondering, what on earth is going on here? Completely unpredicted. And I don't believe that Einstein's name is associated with this experiment because he proposed using unified field. It's because he was a contract civilian physicist employed by the Navy. He was a brilliant guy, and he would have been a logical choice to work on something as interesting as electromagnetically induced stealth. The fact that the experiment went way beyond anything that they had anticipated probably also meant that they had very little chance of reproducing it, because if they didn't understand that this was a nonlinear threshold-dependent phenomena, the assumption might have been that it would be possible to reproduce this experiment at a smaller scale under less, shall we say, heroic test conditions. And if those conditions that achieve that nonlinear result are not met, they're never going to see anything. This is similar to what happened in nonlinear optics. For years, people had predicted, it was known for years that there were nonlinear terms in generalized expansion of optical susceptibility, for example, for materials. So why weren't people seeing things like phase conjugation or frequency tripling or Raman scattering, or stimulated Raman scattering? Well, it was because of the fact that nobody had developed a laser. And what the laser allowed was an optical source whose electric field strength was so large that these normally negligible nonlinear effects suddenly rise up out of the noise, so to speak, and they become not only significant, they become ultimately the dominant effect. And so everything that you've learned about classic optic goes flying out the window if you put a milliwatt of light through a particular type of medium, for example, high-pressure xenon. You don't really see anything other than light transmission and some evidence of refractive index of that material and a little bit of dispersion. If you begin to put tens or hundreds of kilowatts from a laser beam in there, you suddenly find you've got yourself a darn good mirror that is not only reflecting all of that light back, but is actually doing an exact reversal of the phase on the wavefront. This is optical phase conjugation. But the trick is it's threshold dependent. If you are below the threshold for the nonlinear effect, you will not see it. And if you are just marginally at the threshold, you may see it come on and then off, and it'll wink in and out. The Philadelphia experiment, I believe, went well above the threshold, such that they were able to produce at least several times effects that would, for all intents and purposes, have been phenomenal by anybody's standards now or back then.
Sure. Well, to come back to the Philadelphia experiment in a bit, actually, one of the strange things has been, off the record, I guess, and the things that you can't really talk about in public, you've told me an immense amount about the Philadelphia experiment, things that are really just kind of, some of it's educated guesses and some of it's research that you're just not willing to talk about. But I thought I would change subjects for a bit and ask about the idea of UFOs, kind of the popular conscious idea, I guess. You tend to support the idea of some UFOs being ET, and have a much better engineer's perspective on this than most UFOologists do. What can you tell us about the typical UFO from your belief about which reports actually describe ET craft?
Well, I think that some UFOs, and I guess I think it's Stanton Friedman that always emphasizes some, so I'll say some UFOs are probably vehicles that have ultimately an extraterrestrial origin. And I believe that we certainly can learn something about their propulsion mechanism by looking at them. I mean, it's an obvious thing that has intrigued people for years, is the fact that a common shape, it's not the only shape that's seen, but a very common shape, particularly in some of the earlier sightings, was a disc or some version of a spherical shape. And it is no doubt in my mind that this is not a shape that was chosen for aerodynamic purposes, but is in fact chosen because it is symmetric about the axis of a field that has circular symmetry. Some people have speculated that perhaps UFOs have a vertically mounted dipole, if you will, or if you will, a field that concentrates along the axis at the center of the disk, and then that field fringes up and circulates back in through the bottom, like the field pattern around a bar magnet. That has been speculated. I would say that that's an intriguing notion, because some of the work on the unified field theory would suggest that a very complex field structure involving this electromagnetic gravitational field would in fact be the best orientation for propulsion, would in fact be something like that. But it's an eminently more complicated field than just assuming it to be a magnetic dipole. The typical UFO, though, I think presents a problem for us, and if anybody ever has retrieved one of these that has come down, I think it in some ways doesn't surprise me that perhaps less progress has been made with these. I'd like to give an analogy, and I've used this several times when I've talked to groups of people about this. If you and I, Tim, had a time machine, of course that in itself would be a great accomplishment, but let's pretend we just had a time machine and we decided to go back and help the Wright brothers by showing them an SR-71 or maybe even a more advanced aircraft. Maybe think of the Aurora. So we go back and we take an aircraft to them and we say, look, it's got a pulse detonation wave engine, if you believe the stories about Aurora, and it's got all this incredible material on the outside of the aircraft, and it flies at hypersonic velocities way up at this high altitude and all this. We'd probably ruin the Wright brothers, because basically what we would do is we would give them something for which they are not ready to fully appreciate what has gone into it. There are literally decades of aeronautical engineering that have occurred between the Wright brothers and the SR-71 or the Aurora. So many decades have occurred that the SR-71 and the craft that have come since it are based on aerothermodynamics. That's the hypersonic regime. The Wright brothers aren't even supersonic. They're back in a essentially non-compressible flow, subsonic. Well, we would give them so many wrong ideas. We would tell them, oh, the aircraft has to be all metal. And, if they bought into this, probably what it would do, if it didn't just outright discourage them, is they would go down some very unproductive paths in an attempt to reproduce something that they don't have all of the other engineering and science skills caught up yet to basically produce things at that level of sophistication. What they need to look at is basically cloth stretched over a framework with a gasoline-powered engine.
Sure.
And that was, in fact, what they chose. Well, it's a similar thing with the ETs. When we are looking at those vehicles, we are looking at vehicles that are probably in my opinion, several hundred years ahead of where we are. I don't think they're much more than that, and I have reasons for saying this that I'm not going to go into here, but they're probably about several hundred years ahead of what we have right now, meaning they have anti-gravity, but they have gone through version 1, 2, 3, 4, and a whole bunch of failures in between, and they've had a learning curve, and they've probably changed the engine, just as the Wright brothers' plane is traceable to the Aurora. Nevertheless, if you looked at the engine on the Aurora and you look at the engine on the Wright brothers, you might not even recognize it as an engine on the Aurora. I mean, the Wright brothers might be stumped to try and figure out, where's the propeller? Well, I think there's a better source of inspiration for the anti-gravity inventor, and that is the German research from World War II. What is known about it, and more is known than I think a lot of people understand, there we have technology that was developed by humans. It was not ET inspired, in my opinion. It was based on physics that was rooted in the 1920s and 1930s using engineering and physics skills that were available at that time. If you go back and you look at, for example, the German Bell device, or another one that I'm aware of, these are devices that, while the principles that they're operating on ultimately may be related to what UFOs use, the engineering and the design is something that we can grasp now. And using perhaps a little bit more of an updated approach, those, in my opinion, are a far better starting point rather than trying to go immediately to a vehicle that, frankly, is probably going to stump us.
Well, are there any thoughts that you might have on how the Bell device actually worked?
Well, I think the Bell device probably was based on some work that Gerlach started with Einstein. It's very interesting. We were talking earlier in the interview about unified field theory, and Gerlach's name certainly shows up a lot in discussions of the Bell device. Well, what do we know about Gerlach? Well, here's something. Gerlach was collaborating with Einstein in the late 1920s, and they were specifically interested in looking for experimental verification of unified field theory. And the kind of ideas that were kicking around at that time involved things like spinning metals, certain particular metals with intrinsic properties that might be related to this torsion tensor, the idea of rotating fields. The idea basically is not too far from some of the work that you saw, Einstein-de Haas effect and the de Haas-Van Alphen effect, some of these things that basically are even associated with materials like bismuth, and as a result of that, Gerlach may have been well positioned that if an observation was made in a research lab of an effect, perhaps with a rotating mass of mercury or bismuth, because they both have intrinsic properties. If you know which properties to look for, they both have the right property that would be of interest to trying to apply unified field theory. He may have capitalized on either an accidental or partially accidental result that was observed during research to try and do a verification of some of these theories of Einstein about unified field theory. So Gerlach certainly plays a role in that. Now, what I can also tell you about that device is, just based on my own work, it's a pretty good description of what I would expect a device would look like to try and set up a very large stress through the torsion field on, if you will, the local space-time. This is the type of configuration, if you assume that those counter-rotating drums with the material in them, and also notice there's a core applied to this, which would suggest that it's a field intensification, that liquid sort of metallic gel paste that I guess was placed in the core. You see these things counter-rotating, which would set up a stress condition through the torsion tensor, which might, and you can underline might here, be a way of invoking gravitational type effects. But keep in mind, the Bell produced significant biological effects. It also produced very significant electrical interference effects. And I'm here to tell you, and anyone else who's interested, you pull the tail of the cat, you're going to get the whole cat. Basically, you're going to get a unified field, or at least a electromagnetic gravitational field, and you do not get to just pick and choose which parts you like and then throw away the rest. Just like when you have a radio wave coming at you, you get the magnetic field component and the electric field component.
Sure.
You can get static fields that don't have that linkage between them. Actually, they do, but it's on a more subtle level. But, the truth is, what we're seeing with the Bell device, in my opinion, is a system that basically was probably based on unified field theory, experimental work started by Gerlach, inspired by Einstein's theories, and it's right in line with the sort of thing that would come out of an application of Gabriel Krone's unified field theory analysis of rotating machines.
Well, this is something I tried to avoid mentioning earlier, actually, when you were talking about the Philadelphia experiment. It was the reason why I changed the subject so rapidly. But you mentioned bismuth and mercury, and one of the things that you had indicated was that there's a belief, at least, that bismuth was mixed in with the hull welds on the Philadelphia experiment to improve welding, believe it or not. Just make the thing a little bit...
It's a possibility that it was, Tim. We're not sure and completely sure about this. It turns out that the destroyer escort class of ships was having a lot of difficulty with the stability of the welds. And at a certain point in the production cycle, there were materials added, bismuth was one of them, to basically make the ship more weldable, to make the steel in the hull more weldable, basically to soften it up so that it was less prone to the type of cracking that can sometimes occur with a more brittle metal composition. And so it is possible that that actually was part of the experiment that was completely unintended. You know, they may have simply looked at the bulk magnetic property of that material and not realized that embedded within that there was actually a trace compound in there that would have had a, shall we say, large response to the to an electromagnetic gravitational type of effect. So that a way to look at it is that think of it as a nonlinear optics experiment, but with even more. A nonlinear optics experiment, you take a pump wave and you put it into a nonlinear material, and there's an interaction between the pump wave and that nonlinear medium, which transfers part of the energy of that pump wave into a different type of mode. It can change the frequency. It can basically do something like phase conjugation. It can do something like stimulated Raman scattering, and there are some even more esoteric effects such as self-phase modulation. And it converts part of the input laser beam into, if you will, a different type of optical signature. Well, what may have gone on in both the Bell device and the unified field theory, and more importantly in the device that I'm most familiar with in the Rhine Valley of Germany, is that an electromagnetic field was put into it, and now interacting with this structure and this material that was in it, it didn't just transfer the field energy to, shall we say, different frequency content or something like that. It actually transferred part of the field energy into an electromagnetic gravitational structure. Think of it as a transformer. You put in electromagnetic power, and what is induced, or what that is partially converted into, is a more complex field that has this gravitational term linked to it.
Well, to redirect for just a sec, now you just mentioned the Rhine Valley experiment, and that is part of a secondary facility that the Nazis had tested in the Rhineland and Black Forest. What more can you tell us about this, and what do we know about the device being tested there?
Well, I was fortunate enough to actually track down someone who had direct knowledge of this experiment. What appears to have happened is that the research that ultimately led to the Bell device produced a couple of offshoots, or perhaps we're looking at something that was a more sophisticated, or shall we say, the next generation past the Bell device. There was a facility in the Rhine Valley that was apparently being noted as a source of electromagnetic interference to Allied aircraft. And this, coupled with some intelligence that was apparently available through some ground operatives, resulted in a mission right at the end of hostilities in Europe to basically try and get into this facility to find out if the Germans had made any kind of breakthrough. Now, you have to put this into the right context. The primary thrust of the Allies in terms of German technology was not even rocketry, it was the German atomic bomb program. That was the main concern. So there was a mission that went into the Rhine Valley with the intent of primarily getting to the facility that was doing the bomb research. As a secondary goal, that team had also been told, well, if you hear anything else interesting from local Germans while you're going around there, I mean, you know, feel free to investigate, but your primary directive is get to the German bomb facility. The guy who led that was Peter Goodschmidt, and he was extremely skeptical of any German research outside of the bomb program, and in fact he even considered their rocketry to be nothing more than just nonsense and thought it would never amount to anything. Unfortunately, he was very wrong. The current missile crisis concern is an indication of that. Well, he apparently passed up opportunities to go to places where they were testing what the locals described as death rays. And these were, in my opinion, not death rays in the sense we think of them now, but it really was a kind of a generic term from that era, meaning any type of electronic device that through radio waves or whatever produces interference, or if you will, we might refer to it now as either directed energy or electronic warfare. Well, anyway, let's get back to this facility. Suffice to say, there was a team separate from this mission that was looking for the bomb that did reach a facility where a device was seen, and some of the operating principles were noted. There were a few technical people on this team. And this device, unlike the Bell, was stationary until you got into the internal mechanisms and you realized now what they had done was they were holding, in this case it was mercury. The mercury was stationary, but the electromagnetic field was rotating. Now, again, let me be very clear about this. I do not mean a rotating magnetic field in the sense of the polyphase system for AC motors. I'm referring to actually a rotating electromagnetic wave. Now, it turns out anyone that's interested in that will have to track that down. There are three classes of waves. Everybody knows about traveling waves, and everybody's heard about standing waves. There's a third, much less commonly known class called a rotating wave. And this structure was indeed producing a rotating wave interacting with stationary mercury. Well, you might look at that and say, well, it's different from the Bell, but it isn't. In the reference frame of the mercury, it doesn't really matter whether it's the mercury rotating around through the field or whether the field is simply being rotated around through stationary mercury. I mean, motors and generators basically both work. This device, however, though, apparently produced significant levitation effects on objects that were nearby. It also demonstrated what we would refer to as strong electronic warfare effects. It would knock out ignition systems and just play havoc with any electronics. Again, I go back to my comment, pull the tail of the cat, you get the whole cat. You can't have gravity in this type of gravity, the propulsive type of gravity. You can't induce it and then just throw away the EM term because they're one and the same. That's what unified field theory means. So basically, this device was tested, was not properly understood, would probably be an understatement, but it was demonstrated enough so that members of that team saw that it was doing something highly remarkable. But the follow-up work on it, there was absolutely no appreciation of what was going on. In fact, the indication that I have is that when the reports came back to more seasoned scientists within the United States about this, they simply said, this is nonsense. There must have been a large magnet. Basically, the explanation that was offered was not too different from people who've tried to explain away the Hutchison effect. They have magnets hidden somewhere and all of that. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And so, from what I can tell, another opportunity to make a big jump ahead based on what the Germans had done during World War II was lost because of the fact that the results were assumed to be irrelevant since this thing hadn't made it wasn't decisive in winning the war. That's part of the problem, was at the end of World War II, everyone was thinking the atomic bomb was the only thing that had really contributed to the success of decisively winning the war. No one believed that the Germans might have had something else that they were working on, which, had it been pursued, would have been equally significant. I can also tell you that this device was reproduced, at least on a somewhat smaller scale, but not too small a scale. It was a big device, too, pretty good sized, over 10 feet tall, and that it did demonstrate definite anomalous effects, though not at the magnitude or severity that was associated in the German facility. And in fact, it definitely showed a threshold behavior that, again, if too little power was put into it, this device would fail to produce the type of effects that anyone was hoping for. this, I think, was one of the things that helped kind of confirm or at least push me in the direction of understanding that it's not a matter of just building something. It's a matter of basically having all of the conditions in the right sequence with a certain amount of power and a certain amount of field strength. It may seem boring, but I keep coming back to that. For any inventors that are interested, you need to achieve a critical field strength, a critical field density, a critical field geometry with a particular nonlinear material, and you need to do this with also properties like polarization and bandwidth, and there have to be some other factors that I'm going to leave out of this discussion because those are the ones that I think are the most interesting, and I'll keep those for now. But at any rate, there is a threshold dependent on this, and it is absolutely necessary to keep these experiments at least at a certain scale in order to see these effects, or to at least see them in their full magnitude. The Germans apparently had done this. Now, if that work was a direct derivation of the bell, I suspect it at least had its common origins because both of them were involved with, if you will, rotation and mercury.
Absolutely. Well, John, that's all the time that we have for part 2 of our interview, although I definitely would like to continue this in another segment at a later time. And thanks again for explaining these concepts to us. This has been a great walkthrough on some of the physics and a good background information on both the Philadelphia experiment, the Nazi bell device, and some of their other experiments, as well as touching upon the fields apparently working in the Hutchison effect.
I believe that I'll just conclude by saying I think that Hutchison and others, and I basically will put myself in that category too, have seen these effects. And one of the things that's very clear is you got to work really hard to get these effects to be reproducible. The thing that I think is a good goal for us to go for is not necessarily to immediately build a UFO, but it's to realize that in the German research, their systems worked every time they were turned on. And that, in my opinion, is the first thing we've got to strive for, is reproducibility.
Absolutely. Well, we will pick this up in part 3, hopefully, and I will let you go for the time being.
All right. Thank you, Tim.